few weeks ago, Novel AI released their anime image generation model, shortly followed by the release of Waifu Diffusion version 1.3. And the internet's response was, well, you can imagine. My first thought was that this would be an incredible tool to create visual novel games, which are a genre of games that are popular in Japan that blend storytelling along with interactive elements. So today, let's see if we can use the latest version of Waifu Diffusion to design our own visual novel style video game. In Australia, we have a tradition where schools do yearly athletics carnivals or sports days. So I thought, let's take that concept, set it in the future, and dial it up to 100. So the main character is a girl who's just started at a new school. Her passion is running and track and field, and on her first day it's the yearly sports carnival. However, it just turns out this school is full of serious competitors. You have a girl who's replaced her weak human form with a cybernetic body, a wealthy girl who can afford the latest gadgets and competes while using a mobile phone. There's an Eastern European athlete who's been pumped from steroids at a young age, and the final boss is a competitor who's sold their soul to a demon in exchange for athletic prowess. So for this game concept, we're going to need a few screens. Of course, we're going to need a dialogue screen, which is typical for most visual novel games. There's things like map screens, which we might not look at this time, and then of course the battle screen, which is essentially just a running race. So to get started, we need to install Waifu Diffusion version 1.3. I'll put the link in the description. You just need to go to the Files and Versions tab, scroll down, and then download the checkpoint. I would recommend just downloading the full checkpoint. You can also download the pruned float 16 or 32 checkpoints. The OPT checkpoint is not recommended for inference as it's designed to be used for training purposes. If you're running the automatic 11.11 version of Stable Diffusion, you might also want to try downloading the fine-tune that's available as a VAE file. Once the files are downloaded, you'll just need to put them in your models folder and rename them. I have highlighted the files above as an example. So the first thing to note once you've got Waifu Diffusion working is that the way you prompt it is slightly different to Stable Diffusion. It's been trained on Danburu tags, so we'll need to use different keywords compared to the normal Stable Diffusion. Some of the quality tags I would recommend would be things like key visual and high res and official art. For negative tags, you might want to add blurry, low res, as well as identify things that you don't want in the image. In this case, because I'm creating a background, I've added scenery to my prompt, and then to the negative prompt I've added people, girl and boy because I don't want images with people in it. Okay, so let's just do a few generations and see what we get. So I thought this image had potential, but unfortunately the running track is a little bit incoherent, and it's also in the wrong direction. What we really want is to have just the running track run across the screen in 2 lanes. So there are a couple of ways we could get what we want. We could obviously spend time refining our prompts and doing larger batches of generations, or the way I find, which is a little bit easier, is you can just take an image that has some of the elements that you like, do a quick paint over in Photoshop, and then as you'll see in a minute, what we're going to do is put it back into image to image and run it through again. Also tried to find a grass style brush so I could create some foreground elements. Now we're back in Stable Diffusion, we can use image to image on the image that we created in Photoshop. I start by just copying the same prompt and negative prompt. Then I've just adjusted the strength a little bit. You'll find that you need to adjust the strength probably the most out of all the settings. At a low strength, the final result will be pretty similar to the original image. At a higher strength, however, the result will be considerably different. I think it's also worth mentioning with Waifu Diffusion that I find myself using a higher strength in general. With Stable Diffusion, I'd use, strength around 0.2 to maybe 0.7. With Waifu Diffusion, I probably tend to find myself around 0.5 to 0.9. I'm guessing this is because it's a fine-tuned model that's using a smaller data set. which is also probably why you don't have to generally provide as much artistic detail in your prompt text. So you can see the AI version now has essentially refined the quick brush over that I did. However, I still felt like the image was missing something. So let's see if we can add a building to the background. I've just created a grey box and then quickly brushed in some details like a door, some windows, some other elements. You can see I've put absolutely zero effort into the drawing in this case. I really just wanted to demonstrate that you don't have to have great drawing skills in order to get something that works. After that, I've just added some additional noise using the Photoshop noise filter, and then just did a quick blur of the image. It's a good idea if you've got a really simple shape like this to just add a bit of noise. The reason for this is I find that without it, then the AI can sometimes struggle to add detail, even at a higher strength. So now we have some images that we can work with. So what I'm going to do is essentially just combine the parts that I really like from a few different images together in Photoshop. I like the background of some of these images, but unfortunately the foreground that we really want has been kind of lost. So we're just going to take the best parts of the various images and put them back together again. So here I'm really just using the masking tools in Photoshop and the brush tools and just creating selections and moving parts around. So for this exercise, we're really not that worried about the details. We're really just trying to dial in on the concept and just express the general feelings of what we're wanting to show. So I think it's good just to have fun with it. Treat it like a tool that allows for rapid exploration of different ideas and experimentation. So for the main character, I'm just going to take the sketch that we did and then just quickly brush in some rough details. It's really what we're looking for is just a silhouette. Since we're going to be using image to image, we're just trying to rough out the basic forms and shapes. The more detailed your initial sketch is, the more control you're going to have on the final output. But it's also interesting sometimes just to start with something really rough and see what the AI can come up with. I'm consistently blown away by the sort of output that the AI can create. At the same time, coming from a family of artists, I am somewhat conflicted by this new technology. At the same time, I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of it. It's without a doubt one of the most incredible artistic tools ever created. As someone who really believes in the benefit of creative expression, a world where more people get to experience the joy of creating art rather than just consuming it, to me that sounds like a really good thing. I think it's interesting when you look back at older photographs, you notice that they use the same aesthetic of paintings of the same era. A lot of the early photographs were still lifes of fruit bowls and things like that. Now if you fast forward today, painters will integrate things like film grain and chromatic aberration into their artworks in order for them to look more realistic to the modern eye. Ultimately, no one really knows where all this is going, how far we're going to get and how quickly. So I think it's completely normal to be worried or even fearful of a new technology like this. At the same time, it's sometimes easy to forget that ultimately the world changes every day. Every day you wake up, the world is a little bit different. People used to talk a lot about drum machines replacing drummers. Now they talk about AI replacing artists. In a way, maybe drum machines did kind of replace drummers, I don't know. But at the same time, whole new genres of music became viable because of electronic music production tools. For me, the goal is always to get the ideas that I have out onto the page. So any tools that make that easier, I'm all for. So I kind of wasn't really feeling the original pose, and unfortunately I forgot to switch scenes when I switched back to Photoshop, so I lost the recording, but what I did was I just took one of the generations and did a quick rough paint over it. I think it's worth pointing out that this is again one of the advantages of these new tools. Basically I was able to validate pretty quickly if that pose worked with a rendered image, and then kind of pivot on the spot once I saw it in place and I wasn't really happy with it. Instead of spending, like an hour or more creating a final sketch only to throw it in the bin. So in this video I'm not really going to be pushing the art style super far. You could definitely spend more time and experiment with different art styles. It's actually really interesting to blend different artists together, or even film directors, like if you wanted to see an anime directed by Tim Burton. If you spend the time you can definitely come up with some interesting and unique styles. So here I'm once again just going through the process of masking out the image, blending it in Photoshop and adding some color correction, and later on I added a little bit of motion blur. Okay, so let's get started on the first opponent. So the concept for this character is she's essentially a rich girl who's, well, I guess riding on like a hoverboard. I hate calling those things hoverboards because they don't hover and they're not really a board. But the idea is she's kind of this annoying character because while you're putting all this effort into running the race, she's just sitting back on a mobile phone with a VR headset, cruising along. So I think to design a good antagonist for a visual novel game, we need more than just a cool design. It takes more than just an interesting visual design to make an interesting character, as cool as a raptor on a skateboard might be. For the conflict to be engaging, we need to find an opposing worldview. In this case, our opponent believes that money equals power, that she is entitled to win. She doesn't need to work hard because she can afford to buy her way to victory, and her life has kind of reinforced this worldview. Anyone who is poorer than her doesn't deserve to compare. Of course, when she's defeated by a new student with limited means, worldview is completely shattered. So I think this kind of conflict is a lot more interesting. It's a pretty common theme at the center of a lot of animes, one where a character's self-belief can overcome almost anything. It's common in Western storytelling traditions for main characters to undergo a more complex change arc, but I've noticed in a lot of animes the central character tends to have a relatively flat arc. However, what they do tend to have is a lot of impact on the story arcs of the characters around them. I think this style of storytelling actually works really well for anime, but of course it's also really well suited to video games. So it's taken a few iterations just to kind of dial in this prompt a little bit. You can see I added the parenthesis around the side view. That kind of emphasizes that particular part of the prompt. It essentially kind of boosts it. In Photoshop, really, it's just a matter of doing the same thing. So it's just simply a matter of masking out the image. Once again, I just jumped back into image to image in Stable Diffusion and cropped in on the face. So I wanted to just create a portrait shot that we could use as well on the screen. So I just wanted to try something different, which is actually creating the UI elements and then running those UI elements through Stable Diffusion image to image. So I started by just creating some rough mock-ups of the shapes that I wanted to create. So this is the first time I've tried to create user interface elements using Stable Diffusion. I found that it was a little bit challenging at first. I think because I used a green background, it actually tried to convert the image to kind of a circuit board. So this is an example where negative prompts are really important. So in this case, I added things like a circuit board to the list of negative prompts. You'll see I also added things like app design, web design, and other things to the negative prompt as well. So just adding a few finishing touches to this screen. I added some speed lines and this like fire trail. Obviously it's just concept art and not final art, but the idea of this exercise is really just to show how quickly we can take a concept and render it out. That might give you enough confidence to then go ahead and start writing code and prototyping the game mechanics. Or maybe you're like me and you just like creating game concepts for fun. So the next screen I'm going to work on is the dialogue screen. So once again, I kind of handicapped myself by trying to draw using a mouse. But look, at the end of the day, you don't have to have a really detailed drawing. You just need to get kind of the basic colors in place, the basic shapes and composition. As you can see, once again, image to image comes through with the goods. So basically I'm just working through selecting the best generation that I like from the list and then running it again, selecting another generation, running it again, and just going through and doing a few passes. Slowly you're going to get closer and closer to kind of what you have in mind. Sometimes if you're not getting what you want, you might have to update the prompt or even update the negative prompt. Alternatively, if you find you get stuck in sort of a loop where it's giving you pretty similar images consistently, you might have to increase the strength a little bit. So let's start working on the next antagonist character. So for this one I was thinking of something kind of like Ivan Drago from Rocky 3. The character sort of comes from like an Eastern European background. His whole childhood has essentially been spent in this intensely competitive environment. He's been poked and prodded and put through all kinds of various experiments, all aimed at creating superhuman athletes. This has led to a situation where his entire self-worth essentially is tied up in his athletic prowess. Right, well that's enough about what I was thinking of the character. Obviously I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but they were just some of the ideas I had while I was working through this process. So as you can see, I just started with text to image, created a prompt, set up the negative prompt, and then just went through some generations. Once I found a generation I liked, I dropped it back in Photoshop. Unfortunately, it was a little bit cropped, so I had to just brush in some of the detail on the outside. I find this a little bit more effective method than using the existing outpainting tools because you get a more cohesive result. So just by painting in the missing details in Photoshop, it just saves a bit of time. And then I just dropped it back into image to image and just went through the process of refining it and dialing in some of the facial details to get something that I was a bit more happy with. So here we're just working on some of the UI elements. I created some boxes, made them slightly transparent, created an outline around it, gave it a little bit of an outer glow using the Photoshop's layer effects, and then just started putting in some text, mainly just to fill out the page and hopefully just give a bit of a sense of what it might look like once you actually start putting this into a game engine and putting actual text in. So with the UI elements in place, now it's really just a matter of creating a backdrop. So once again, we want to add things like high res, key visual, and then just some information about the kind of scene that we want. So after that, it's really just once we've found a background image that works, we drop it into the scene. Had to play around with it a little bit, adding a blur, but I wasn't really that happy with it. Finally, let's just add a chapter header. This is pretty common with visual novel games, so I just thought, hey, why not put it in there as well? And then really it's just a matter of adding a little bit of color correction at the end, improving the contrast and so on, adding a little bit of vignette. And that's it. Well, this was a pretty fun project. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if there's any other style of games that you want me to cover. That's it. See you next time.